Number 1. Antonio Reyes. A teenage boy allegedly hunted people across Chicago for months, but the city didn't know his name. Number 1 is Antonio Reyes, whose story broke in February 2025. State attorneys claim Reyes was only 16 and 17 years old when he was reportedly tied to 6 murders and 4 other shootings across the Southwest Side throughout 2020. Consider the fact that the person suspected of launching these attacks months apart in various neighborhoods was not some veteran criminal that everyone had been keeping a close eye on. He was just a kid who lived for years, at the center of multiple distinct investigations before the detectives finally realized how all of the patterns actually fit together. Before this case ever reached the front pages, Reyes was never publicly recognized as the face of such a terrifying series. According to law enforcement, he was just a young Chicago man, frequently moving through the Gage Park, Brighton Park, and West Lawn communities. Court records later identified him as a gang member using the street name Red Rum. What makes a case like this so haunting is just how normal the scenery was. These were not hidden places. We are talking about city blocks with gas stations, parked cars, everyday errands, church crowds, and people waiting for rides. The formal accusations now paint a dark picture of violence that investigators claim impacted both complete strangers and people he knew. Police believe the first killing linked to Reyes occurred on March 2, 2020, when 31-year-old Francisco Mangana was shot on West 59th Street. Roughly 1 month later, on April 5th, 21-year-old Claudio Cosio was murdered while sitting in his car on South Sacramento Avenue, and another man narrowly survived that same gunfire. Then on May 1st, 16-year-old Daman Duran was found dead in an alley on South Homan Avenue. If you picture living in these neighborhoods back then, the local panic makes total sense. These weren't crimes packed into one night of mayhem. They were spaced out long enough for each case to feel isolated. Long enough, perhaps, for no one outside the precinct to suspect they were all connected. Then came June 24th, 2020. Prosecutors allege Reyes killed 26-year-old Luis Davalos Garcia while Garcia sat inside a car on South Rockwell Avenue. That specific homicide became the major public turning point. Reyes was taken into custody in December 2020 for that murder and has remained behind bars ever since. But investigators say the story didn't end there. When the state revealed the broader indictment in 2025, they claimed that June arrest represented just one small fragment of a much larger horror story. That gives this case its slow burn feel, the feeling that one suspect was caught years ago, while 5 other murder cases were still being stitched into a single narrative. The final 2 homicides in the charge series occurred in November 2020, just 1 day apart. Prosecutors claim 31-year-old Jose Martinez was attacked beside his 3 small children as they went to buy a family puppy, and that Martinez later passed away from those gunshot wounds. The following day, 20-year-old Justin Gonzalez was killed while waiting in a vehicle to pick up his girlfriend. Police say Reyes also faces attempted murder counts linked to those events, including the 3 toddlers who were in Martinez's car. That is where this whole story becomes especially chilling to witness now. It's not just the victim count, but the sheer randomness that the prosecutors described. One guy buying a soda, another waiting for sports, one sitting in a car, another parenting. Ordinary moments shattered without any warning. So, how did the detectives finally connect everything? According to the Chicago police and county attorneys, investigators spent years building this case using ballistics data. They analyzed surveillance video, street tips, social media footprints, and statements Reyes allegedly shared with other people throughout his time incarcerated. A .40 caliber handgun seized after June 2020 murders linked multiple attacks. They also mentioned that Reyes made social media posts that became key digital evidence. But this is where the narrative gets messy. Not every grieving family agreed with the theory that Reyes had no prior connections. The mother of Daman Duran told the Sun-Times that her son had actually known Reyes personally. She said they spent time together and that she even sent messages to the suspect after her son vanished. To put it another way, even as the police presented a clear pattern, the human reality was still messy, emotional, and very contested. The legal machine moved in slow layers, instead of one sudden courtroom finale. Reyes, already locked up for the Davalos Garcia case, was charged in February 2025 with 5 more murders from 2020, bringing the total to 6 homicide counts and 4 attempted murder charges. At later court dates, prosecutors added darker allegations. These included claims that Reyes made confessions to witnesses and acted with total contempt for the victims. His defense lawyers fought back, arguing the state relied on very weak witnesses. This group included felons and jailhouse informants. The defense argues these cooperating witnesses had every reason to say whatever the prosecutors wanted to hear. In a case like this, that really matters, because until the trial starts, the fight isn't about the media headlines. It is about whether the state can prove every charge individually and if the story investigators built can survive a tough cross-examination. Imagine several grieving families living separate nightmares, only to find one single name ties them all together. In 2025, Reyes remains in custody. No final verdict or sentencing exists for the 6 victims yet, because the prosecution is still an active, pending matter. This story ends not with a prison term, but with a question haunting the southwest side of Chicago. How many of these brutal attacks can the state actually prove? How does a teenager become the epicenter of such massive allegations? This lingering mystery outweighs the accusations themselves. Several grieving families spent years believing they were characters in separate tragedies. Then they learned one single name linked every single one of their nightmares. Number 2. Nicholas Troy Shielley. For 6 days in June 2008, the Midwest watched an impossible horror story unfold in real time. One missing man led to bodies in another town, then a family in Rock Falls, then a couple in Missouri. Nicholas Troy Shielley stood at the eye of this storm. This 28-year-old former convict from the Sterling area suddenly became the primary focus of an intense, 2-state police manhunt. Imagine waking up to find the map of death widening as the victim count climbed higher. Police already knew him well. Associated Press reports from July 2008 documented a criminal history spanning from simple marijuana possession and domestic battery to robbery and weapons offenses. Corrections data noted he previously served nearly 3 years for an aggravated robbery conviction. Friends saw a man with a worsening temper, but even they never expected a massacre of this magnitude. These cases rarely start with a massive headline. They begin with a person neighbors think they have already figured out. Detectives say the bloodbath began on June 23, 2008, with 93-year-old Russell Reed. They later discovered Reed's body stuffed inside a car trunk. Prosecutors argued Shielley was desperate for cash and narcotics, making Reed the first casualty in a spree that moved with terrifying speed and felt entirely chaotic. 5 days later, on June 28, 65-year-old Ronald Randall died in Galesburg. Shielley reportedly targeted Randall because he needed a vehicle and couldn't risk a witness calling the police. Randall's stolen pickup truck became the physical thread connecting the crimes, as the situation shifted from alarming to unthinkable. After Galesburg, authorities say Shielley drove back to Rock Falls and entered an apartment where 4 people were slaughtered. The victims were Brock Branson, Kelina Blake, her 2-year-old son, Dion Blake, and Kenneth Ohl. A jury eventually found Shielley guilty on 4 counts of first-degree murder for those specific deaths. The motive? Prosecutors claim Shielley found out his wife, Holly, had been seeing Branson. Think about the investigators processing that scene. A multi-county case had just spiraled into something darker, claiming everyone from an old man to a toddler. Shielley then drove that stolen truck into Missouri, where Tom and Jill Estes were crossing his path. The Arkansas couple was just staying at a Festus hotel after a graduation party when they were killed. An FBI bulletin on July 1, 2008, named Shielley as the prime suspect in 8 separate homicides across 2 states, all involving blunt force trauma. He was considered armed and dangerous as the region entered a state of total public emergency. Digital billboards flashed his face. A $25,000 reward was authorized. News cycles broadcast his image everywhere until the investigation transformed into a literal hunt. The manhunt ended with a strange sense of normalcy on July 1, 2008, when Shielley was recognized and arrested outside a bar in Granite City. He reportedly walked inside, ordered a water, and used the restroom before a customer recognized him. Police and FBI agents swarmed the location and took him into custody without a fight. After days of terror, the monster wasn't caught in a shootout, but while smoking a cigarette outside a local pub. That is often the detail that sticks with you. Evil doesn't always look like a movie villain. Sometimes it just waits in an ordinary room to be noticed. What followed was a massive legal marathon, spanning 2 different states. Shielley didn't face one single trial for all 8 victims. The justice system took him down piece by piece. Knox County convicted him in September 2011 for Ronald Randall's murder, resulting in a life sentence. In November 2012, a Whiteside County jury convicted him in the death of Russell Reed, and he was sentenced in January 2013 to life in prison. For 1 week, he was unstoppable before a Rock Island jury delivered a conviction for those 4 brutal killings. Reuters reported that Holly Shielley testified against him under immunity, giving jurors a witness from inside his most trusted circle. Missouri was the final chapter where prosecutors originally fought to secure the death penalty for the killings of Tom and Jill Estes. In October 2017, Shielley pleaded guilty in Jefferson County to 2 counts of murder and armed criminal action. The Associated Press noted his sentence, life without parole, for the Missouri killings alongside more time for the weapons charges. At that point, the trial was no longer about his freedom, but about documenting a horrific multi-state crime spree. It was about finally closing every file on a week of violence that left 8 people dead across state lines. As of February 2026, prison records list Nicholas Troy Shielley as an inmate at Western Illinois Correctional Center. In practical terms, his case is over in exactly the way the law measures such horrific things. With multiple life sentences, he has no path back to society. Yet for families, over is simply the wrong word. The court case ended and the prison term is permanent, but the pain from June 2008 remains. The Shielley case lingers for reasons beyond the total number of victims. It was the velocity, the way one act blurred into the next, before anyone understood the shape of the threat. Imagine being in those towns in June 2008, hearing one report, then another, then yet another. Realizing they were all connected is the part of the story that stays with people. It wasn't simply that he killed 8 people, but that for nearly a week, he made 2 states feel helpless. For 6 days, 2 states became a map of panic, and no one knew where it would end until it stopped. Number 3. Darren Dion Van. When police arrested Darren Dion Van in October 2014, they believed they were closing just one solitary homicide. Instead, they were stepping into a map of abandoned houses, missing women, and years of deep, unanswered fear. Within hours of his arrest, investigators said Van began leading them toward more bodies hidden throughout Gary, Indiana. Then came the unsettling hint from the suspect himself. The known victims were likely not the full story. Imagine being a detective, realizing the suspect in front of you is not the end, but the beginning. Before his name was tied to 7 killings, Van appeared to be a man drifting through various versions of adult life. He was a Marine. He spent time in Texas and was convicted there in 2009 before returning to Indiana after serving his sentence. By 2014, authorities identified him as a registered offender living in Gary, a city already struggling with neglect. He lived among the empty, decaying buildings that most people pass by without a second glance. That setting matters because these crimes unfolded in the very places people have learned not to look at closely. The killings for which Van was convicted stretched through 2013 and 2014, targeting vulnerable women in Gary. The final victim was 19-year-old Africa Hardy, found in a Hammond motel room in October 2014. That discovery changed everything as police traced evidence to Van, who then began directing them to more victims. One by one, names emerged. Aneth Jones, T. Ira Beatty, Christine Williams, Tracy Martin, Sonia Billingsley, and Tanya Gatlin. DNA testing identified some while others were named quickly, turning hidden bodies back into people and making the pattern undeniable. What made the case especially haunting was the terrifying speed of the discovery. Police weren't finding victims months apart. They were uncovering them in a rush across the city's abandoned buildings. Imagine the pressure those first days. Detectives moved from location to location while families watched the news, praying their loved one wasn't the next update. A city used to being overlooked suddenly became the epicenter of a major serial killer investigation. Hammond's police chief stated that Van admitted to Hardy's death before leading officers to 6 other bodies. Officials said his violence started much earlier, a possibility hanging over the investigation. Then the story widened beyond Indiana, in recorded interviews later obtained and reported by NBC Chicago. Van told detectives he had killed significantly more victims in Illinois than in Northwest Indiana. That claim is why his name is now tied to dozens of unsolved strangulation cases that are currently under renewed scrutiny. But this is where the facts need to stay very careful. Before the cuffs were cold, his admissions turned those Illinois cold cases into a national obsession. However, public records fail to show any Illinois murder convictions linked to those wider allegations. Essentially, we are tracking two Darren Van stories. One ended in 7 murder convictions. The other is a haunting shadow of crimes that might never be proven. But what exactly did investigators overlook? The massive investigation forced a difficult question into public view. Just how many warning signs did authorities miss? For years, researchers and officials argued that clusters of women found dead in Gary and Chicago needed deeper analysis. Once Van was caught, those theories became a terrifying reality. Public pressure in Chicago eventually forced police to review more than 50 unsolved strangulation and suffocation cases involving women found on the south and west sides. Police later claimed DNA from those scenes did not link to one killer. Many others still believe the patterns are far too obvious to ignore. That lingering doubt became a permanent part of the Van legacy. It was never just about his specific confessions. It was about what his arrest forced the entire region to re-examine. Legally, the path to justice took several years to resolve. Prosecutors initially charged Van for killing Africa Hardy and Anneth Jones and sought the death penalty, while adding more victims to the list. By 2016, 5 more murder charges were filed, bringing his grim total to 7. Defense motions, trial delays, and a legal challenge against the death penalty law in Indiana slowed everything down before the case ever reached a jury. It seemed like the courtroom battle would drag on for another decade. Then in May 2018, mere months before trial, Van suddenly pleaded guilty to all 7 murders. This plea deal avoided a capital trial and ensured jurors would never have to hear every gruesome detail. On May 25, 2018, a judge handed Darren Dion Van 7 concurrent life sentences without parole. Practically speaking, he will spend every remaining day in prison. The Indiana convictions represent the only certainties the legal system has secured. 7 victims, 1 guilty plea, and 7 life terms. Those broader claims in Illinois remain something else entirely. They are chilling, influential, and still completely unresolved in the verified public record. His current status is clear, but his full history of violence remains a mystery. The most haunting part of Darren Dion Van is not the body count. It is the image of a motel room, an arrest, and a chain of abandoned houses yielding horrific answers. Consider how this story shifts from the outside. At first, it looks like one isolated crime scene, then a second, then a third, until the true horror is not just what they discovered, but the fact that so many women were left waiting for answers. That is why this case resonates. Despite the convictions, we are left with one final, uncomfortable question. How many warnings does a city need before it realizes a monster is already at work? Number 4. Andrew Urdiales. For years, Andrew Urdiales harbored the most terrifying kind of secret a killer can keep. Distance, different jurisdictions, different states, and different decades. If you viewed the cases individually, the pattern was almost invisible. But once investigators finally aligned the timeline, the full picture became absolutely chilling. Prosecutors identified Urdiales, a former Marine from Chicago, as the man responsible for 8 murders across Southern California and Illinois. By the time the legal system finished with him, he stood convicted of all 8. Before he was known as a serial killer, Urdiales looked like a man living a disciplined, structured life. He moved to Southern California as a 19-year-old Marine and served at military bases throughout the 1980s and early 1990s. That is what makes this so disturbing. Imagine a man with that background, someone who understood military discipline and how to project total control. Prosecutors later argued that behind that normal exterior was a man who flipped from calm to deadly without warning. One Cook County prosecutor described him as uniquely calculating a predator who learned from his mistakes and left almost nothing behind. The California murders began in 1986. Authorities stated that 23-year-old Robin Brandley was attacked after a concert at Saddleback College in Mission Viejo. Then came Julie McGee in 1988, Mary Ann Wells later that year, and Tammy Irwin in 1989. Prosecutors linked these crimes to Urdiales while he was stationed in California, proving 3 victims were shot with the same gun. After a gap of several years, prosecutors said he returned to Palm Springs in 1995 and killed Denise Maney. Imagine the frustration of those detectives. 5 victims in different counties, years apart, with no obvious thread connecting them. Yet, the most pivotal moment in this entire investigation was not a murder, but a miracle. In September 1992, 19-year-old Jennifer Asbenson climbed into a car with a man she thought was harmless. 8 victims and 3 death sentences ended with a bedsheet in a cell. That man was Ortiz. She escaped. Her testimony was vital because it exposed his patterns and proved how fast a routine moment can turn into horror. Imagine missing your bus and accepting a ride from a stranger because it felt like the simplest decision that day. Years later, Aspenson's words forced jurors to feel the human cost beyond forensic files. Then, the entire geography shifted. In 1996, after leaving the Marines for Illinois, authorities linked Erdi Ali to 3 fresh female murders there: Lori Wawaki, Cassandra Coram, and Lynn Huber. Authorities claimed these Illinois crimes occurred within a span of only 3 months. This is where the story tightens. A killer haunting California appeared in a fresh series closer together. In 1996, Indiana police stopped Erdi Ali's truck and found a gun. At that moment, the stop did not look like the end of a serial killing spree, but ballistics later tied that weapon to the Illinois killings. By 1997, he was finally arrested. Prosecutors claimed that once he was jailed, the dark secrets of his California past finally began to surface. The case turned on an investigator's dream, a confession followed by physical support for every single one of those horrific parts. Illinois authorities built their initial prosecution around the brutal slayings of Lori Wawaki and also Lynn Huber. In 2002, Erdi Ali was sentenced to death. Then came a twist involving politics and the law. In January 2003, Governor George Ryan commuted all death sentences in Illinois, including the one for Erdi Ali. But the story continued. Prosecutors still held Cassandra Coram's case. By 2004, Erdi Ali was convicted there and once again received a death sentence. Can you imagine being a family member and hearing death sentence twice, only to realize nothing was settled yet? Everything changed in 2011 when Illinois abolished the death penalty and Governor Pat Quinn commuted remaining sentences to life. Within hours, California officials launched a mission to bring Erdi Ali's West to face 5 long unsolved murders there. He was extradited in October 2011 as Orange County prosecutors prepared a 5-count case for a trial. That detail matters because it reveals the massive time required to assemble this prosecution. These weren't fresh crimes. They were old wounds reopened one by one until the state finally possessed the full map. The California trial finally reached a verdict in May 2018. A jury convicted Erdi Ali's of 5 counts of first-degree murder for the deaths of Robin Brawley, Julie McGee, Marianne Wells, Tammy Irwin, and Denise Maney. By June, that same jury officially recommended death. On October 5, 2018, a judge formally sentenced him to death for those murders. By that point, the legal record was stark. 3 convictions in Illinois and 5 more in California totaled 8 women. The defense had no room left to argue identity. The courtroom struggle had shifted from who did it to a debate over how the law would punish him. Even then, the ending was not expected. Erdi Ali's never spent years awaiting an execution in California. Less than 1 month after his sentencing, guards found him unresponsive inside his cell at San Quentin. AP reported that prison staff discovered him during a check. The Department of Corrections listed his death as a suicide on November 3, 2018. So after decades of investigations, multiple trials, 2 states, and repeated death sentences, the final chapter arrived in prison silence. What makes Andrew Erdi Ali's linger in the mind is not just the body count. California first, then Illinois, then back. A Marine, then a prisoner. A man who stayed compartmentalized until investigators proved those rooms were all connected. Imagine the family's pain before that dark connection was made. Every family believed their personal loss was an isolated nightmare. In the end, that remains the most haunting part. It's not just the 8 convictions, but that his true nature stayed hidden in plain sight. Number 5. Bruce Lindahl. Some killers are caught in court, others by time. Bruce Lindahl belongs to that second and very unsettling category. He died in 1981, years before DNA testing could map the destruction investigators believe he caused across Chicago's western suburbs. For decades, he was more rumor than record, a name in old files, survivor accounts, and deaths. Then, forensics pulled those separate threads together. By 2024, Illinois prosecutors said DNA linked Lindahl to two cold cases, adding the proof investigators suspected for years. Before he accidentally killed himself while murdering a teenager, Lindahl didn't look like the monster people imagine at the center of a serial case. He grew up in the Chicago suburbs, finished Downers Grove North High School, studied electromechanics, and found steady work as an electrician. People around him often described him as social and outwardly normal. That contrast matters when meeting someone who seems local, familiar, and dependable. Then the truth emerged. Investigators now believe he moved through the late 1970s and early 80s, leaving a trail of missing women, assaults, and killings behind him. Authorities stated he may be responsible for as many as 12 murders and 9 attacks in the west suburbs, though forensic evidence only confirms some. The first case now firmly tied to Lindahl is the 1976 killing of Pamela Moore. Pamela was 16, a Downers Grove South student who left to buy a soft drink and never came back home again. Roadside workers found her body in Leol the next day, yet the case had no clear answer for more than 4 long decades. Investigators finally used new forensic methods, including exhumed DNA from Lindahl's remains, to identify him as the person responsible for the crime. Think about what that means for a cold case. It is not just a mystery solved, but a face replacing the word unknown. In January 2020, DuPage County authorities announced that breakthrough publicly, but Pamela Moore's case was not the end of the story. It was a beginning. Investigators said that once Lindahl was identified in the Moore killing, they moved. They began revisiting other files that had long sat in the background, including the 1979 death of Kathy Howa from North Aurora. According to investigators, Hallie left her apartment on March 29, 1979. She planned to pick up her sister at a shopping center but never arrived. Her body was found weeks later in the Fox River. For decades, the case stayed unsolved until October 2024, when DNA on Holly's clothing matched the genetic profile of Bruce Lindahl. The Kane County State's attorney said that if he had still been alive today, they would act. They would have authorized first-degree murder charges and taken the case to trial to seek a final conviction for his crimes. What makes Lindahl's story especially chilling is that it was not built only from cold bodies and sterile lab reports. It was also built from women who survived encounters with him and spent years feeling as though they were speaking into the dark. ABC7 reported in 2020 on Annette Lazar, who said Lindahl attacked her in 1979 and that she went to police but felt ignored. Her account added something cold case summaries often overlook. It is the sense that danger can exist in plain sight, and that even when someone reports it, the system may fail to stop it. Imagine carrying that for decades, knowing you escaped while wondering who else met a darker fate because he remained free. Then there is the Deborah Kander case, which may be the clearest example of how close Lindahl came to facing justice while alive. In 1980, authorities said he abducted and assaulted Kander, who escaped and contacted police from the safety of a neighbor's house. Lindahl was charged, but he posted bail and was released. Then, days before she was supposed to testify, Colliander vanished entirely. The prosecution dropped the charges because their key witness was no longer there. In 1982, months after Lindahl's own death, Collander's body was found in a shallow grave, with evidence pointing directly back to him for her killing. Even if the exact mechanics could no longer be tested in court, the sequence remains one of the most haunting details. Imagine being one court date away from accountability, only for the witness to vanish and the entire prosecution to collapse into nothing. And then came the abrupt ending that froze everything. On April 4th, 1981, Lindahl was found dead in a Neepville apartment alongside 18-year-old Charles Hooer. Authorities said Lindahl fatally stabbed Hooer, but during the attack accidentally severed a major artery in his own leg and bled to death. That single night ended whatever future crimes he might have committed, but it also cut off the normal legal process for his victims. There would be no trial for Pamela Marr, no trial for Kathy Hawley, and no courtroom reckoning for the pattern investigators now believe spanned years. Instead, detectives were left with a dead suspect and a series of families who still had no formal answers for their loss. That is why the legal chapter of Bruce Lindahl's story feels so strange compared with most high-profile serial killer cases. There was a prosecution against him while he was alive in the Colliander case, but it collapsed after her tragic disappearance. The later cases moved in reverse. Detectives worked first, science arrived second, and the public identification came last. In 2020, officials said DNA established that Lindell killed Pamela Moore. In 2024, officials said DNA tied him to Kathy Holla, and they would have charged him with first-degree murder if he were still alive. So, the law reached a conclusion of sorts, but only after the suspect had been dead for decades. His status is simple. Bruce Lindell has been dead since April 1981, leaving no prison sentence, no parole, no appeal, and no final courtroom scene for the families. While a father rotted in prison, the real killer was being promoted as a Marine. This forensic record turned old suspicions into named accusations and, in 2 cases, into public resolutions. Authorities still believe he may be tied to additional killings, but those remain in the category of suspicion rather than the proof now seen in the Marr and Holly cases. Bruce Lindell almost escaped history. He nearly evaded the police, the courts, and history itself. Imagine how easily this stays buried if evidence degrades or files stay closed. If his remains were never exhumed or no one reopened the files. For years, he was a ghost connected only by whispers. Now, he stands as something colder and clearer. A suspected suburban serial killer whose story was not built in one dramatic arrest, but piece by piece over decades until science finished what time could not. What was his hidden secret? Number 6. Jorge Avila Torres. For years, the worst part was not just the crimes in Illinois or Virginia. It was the gap. On Mother's Day, 2005, 2 little girls vanished from Zion, Illinois. 5 years later, investigators realized the person responsible had never actually gone away at all. He simply moved on, joined the Marines, and lived until another violent case pulled everything back into the light. Imagine if a painful cold case in your quiet suburb was sitting in the shadow of an entirely different murder miles away. Avila Torres was local. Records say when Laura Hobbs and Crystal Tobias were killed on May 8, 2005, he was 16 and lived in that same town. Laura was 8, Crystal was 9. They never returned home. Families searched through the night, and the following morning, Laura's father and grandfather found them in the Beulah Park woods. A witness saw them with a teenager like him. Instead, the investigation moved in a completely different direction almost immediately. That direction was Laura's father, Jerry Hobbs. Suspicions hit him fast. He confessed after interrogation, then recanted. He spent 5 years in jail while the real case slipped forward in silence. Imagine being a family already shattered by loss, then watching the law target the wrong man. What did this mean for the killer? He was enlisting resolve. While the father sat in a cell, the real killer was training as a Marine. This is a story of time lost. One mistake echoed for years. While the Zion case stalled, Avila Torres built a new life. By 2009, he was a Marine corporal in Arlington, Virginia. That summer, Navy Petty Officer Amanda Jean Snell was killed in her own barracks room. Federal prosecutors said Avila Torres lived on the same deck, 8 doors away. He later told an inmate he entered her room while she slept and restrained her. He hid her body in a locker until she missed morning duty. It was a mystery on a base, but that was not his end. Something else finally stopped him. Resolve. Street violence. In February 2010, Arlington police finally arrested Avila Torres. One woman survived being left for dead, and her story led investigators straight to him. In December 2010, a court gave him 5 life terms plus 168 years. That should have marked him as one of the most dangerous offenders in the region. But DNA went into the national system, and the old Illinois file suddenly came alive. The breakthrough was as devastating as it was clarifying. DNA from Laura's body cleared Jerry Hobbs and matched Avila Torres. Illinois filed charges in 2012. The entire shape of the case changed. The suspect was no longer a father crushed in an interview room. He was a convict in Virginia, tied to brutal attacks and the murder of Amanda Snell. Imagine being the investigator realizing the answer lived long enough to kill again. The legal process finally moved on 2 tracks. In Virginia, a jury gave him death in 2014 for the premeditated murder of Amanda Snell. While an innocent man rotted in a cell for 5 years, the real predator remained free because his DNA profile sat unexamined in a state database. The Justice Department confirmed the killer was only 25 when that specific sentence was finally handed down. Back in Illinois, defense teams fought to dismantle the genetic evidence, questioning its weight for a potential trial. The Zion tragedy threatened to remain in legal limbo forever. Could a killer really walk free on a technicality? In September 2018, the silence broke when Avila Torres admitted to slaughtering Laura Hobbs and Crystal Tobias in Lake County. Under the terms of that specific negotiation, he accepted a sentence of 100 years behind bars. That admission shuttered one of the most horrific eras in Lake County history, yet it only deepened the surrounding injustice. Judge Daniel Shaines labeled him a definitive serial killer at the hearing, stating he earned every second of that century-long term. Prosecutors confirmed the same biological profile, identifying the murderer also cleared Jerry Hobbs, who lost 5 years to a coerced confession. This left the court facing two jarring realities existing in the same room. You had a monster admitting his guilt, while an innocent man stood as a reminder of the years stolen by investigative failure. But the legal saga had one more twist. For a time, Avila Torres occupied a rare legal space, holding both a 100-year state term and a federal death sentence. Then, the final pivot in this long journey arrived years down the line. On December 23, 2024, President Joe Biden issued a mass commutation for 37 federal death row inmates. Avila Torres made that list. Reports from Arlington confirmed his removal from death row to serve life without any hope of parole. This effectively ended the death penalty for the murder of Amanda Snell. Yet, the functional reality remains the same. He will die in a cage with no path back to civilized society. How did he evade detection for so long? The most disturbing element of Jorge Avila Torres isn't just his body count, but the horrific sequence of his crimes. He killed the girls in Zion, watched an innocent man take the fall, then moved into a Marine barracks in Virginia. Look at the timeline and ask yourself, what if that one DNA profile had never been matched to the scene? That realization is arguably the most haunting part of the entire investigation. It isn't just that Avila Torres was a predator who crossed state lines. It is that the truth was hidden in plain sight, waiting for science to catch up with his trail of blood. Now, number 7, Timothy Kreitzer. Occasionally, a serial murder investigation doesn't start with a fresh body, but with a silent hit from a genetic database. In 2007, Southern Illinois detectives revisited the 1982 slaying of Deborah Shepard, a 23-year-old college student. The lab results pointed directly to Timothy Kreitzer, a man already sitting in a prison cell. Can you imagine receiving that call as a detective? An old piece of evidence sitting in a box for decades suddenly identifies a living, breathing convict rather than a dead suspect. Once that door was forced open, it revealed a nightmare that went far beyond a single cold case. Behind that discovery lay a path of violence cutting through multiple states and years of forgotten terror. Before anyone linked him to 9 deaths, Kreitzer had spent his entire adult life cycling through the American penal system. Records from 2007 show he first entered Illinois prisons in 1963, remaining incarcerated almost continuously, except for one brief window of freedom. During that lapse, he moved to Southern Illinois, enrolled in university, and worked as an EMT and ambulance driver. Think about the contrast. A man studying the law while he systematically broke every moral code. He maintained a normal routine, even responding to medical emergencies in the middle of the night, all while authorities now believe he was committing some of the most brutal crimes in the region. The Shepard murder finally broke his streak. They found her in her Carbondale home in April 1982, just weeks before she was supposed to graduate. The file collected dust for 25 years, until modern testing on a shirt found at the scene flagged Kreitzer in a state prison. He confessed in 2007, but Deborah's murder was just the first domino to fall in a much larger collapse. Investigators quickly realized the same predator might be tied to unsolved killings in Missouri, Kentucky, and Pennsylvania. Imagine being a victim's family and hearing his name for the first time, feeling relief that the ghost has a face, but horror at the scale of his map. That is the slow-burning dread at the heart of the Kreitzer investigation. This wasn't just one town discovering its own hidden monster. This was 4 different states realizing at once that their coldest files all belonged to the same man. Reports from December 2007 noted that jurisdictions began re-examining old files after Kreitzer's Illinois plea triggered a wave of admissions. Police in Reading, Pennsylvania, and Paducah, Kentucky, immediately began dusting off their most tragic unsolved cases. Missouri officials were simultaneously building a massive prosecution as one genetic match turned into a regional waterfall of confessions. A single cold case had ignited a reckoning that stretched across the entire Midwest. A man died in prison for a murder he never committed. In late 2007, Crater finally confessed to killing Deborah Shepard, receiving 40 years. Then, barely 5 weeks later, on January 18, 2008, he admitted guilt in Williamson County for the 1978 slaying of 51-year-old Virginia Lee Weddy, causing a judge to stack 40 more years onto his sentence. Effectively, Illinois had already piled on enough time to ensure he would never leave prison alive, even before other states finished up their legal proceedings. Imagine waiting nearly 3 decades for answers, only to see 2 cold case files suddenly close in 6 weeks. But Illinois was just the beginning. In Missouri, investigators linked Crater to 5 separate killings around the Cape Girardeau area, dating between 1977 and 1982. On April 4, 2008, he entered guilty pleas there for 5 counts of first-degree murder and other charges tied to those attacks. Prosecutors traded the death penalty for his cooperation, resulting in 13 consecutive life sentences handed down by the court as punishment. That courtroom scene was pivotal. It transformed a long-standing theory into a legal reality the justice system could finally grasp. This wasn't just a hunch or a rumor anymore. These were back-to-back life terms for women whose files sat cold for decades. Confessions rattled other states like aftershocks. Pennsylvania authorities charged Crater in the 1979 murder of Myrtle Roop after DNA evidence finally placed him at the scene. In Kentucky, he admitted killing 29-year-old Joyce Tharp, resulting in more penalties handed down in 2010 and 2012. By 2012, reports showed he was already serving 15 life sentences while being held at Pontiac. With 65 extra years added on, his status is clear. When people ask if Timothy Crater is ever getting out, the answer is no. Even if the paperwork continues, he is never leaving that prison. The legal structure ended that possibility years ago. Yet, a haunting piece of this story remains long after the sentencing. His name didn't just solve murders. It unmasked a terrible injustice. According to the Illinois Innocence Project, Grover Thompson was the victim of a system that failed him completely. Thompson died in prison in 1996, receiving posthumous clemency in 2019 after Crater confessed to the 1981 stabbing of Ida White. That was the very crime Thompson was wrongly convicted of. It became the first posthumous exoneration in the history of Illinois. Think about that for a second. One man's admission solved a murder while also proving another man lost years of his life for a crime he didn't do. That is why Crater's story still resonates. It isn't just about the 9 lives he admitted to taking across multiple states, but how long the truth stayed buried and the cruelty of it arriving too late to save everyone. Number 8. Paul Runa. For years, the terror surrounding Paul Runa wasn't built on a single neighborhood, one specific victim, or one lone night of violence. It was the sheer repetition. A woman vanishes, then another, until a suspicious house fire pulls back the curtain on something darker. Then, a mother and child are discovered together. Imagine living in the Chicago suburbs in the mid-90s and hearing these stories. Were they connected? Locals only felt a growing dread that something was fundamentally wrong in the exact same way every time. By the time police named Runa in 2001, his confession was absolutely staggering to the public. They said he admitted to murdering 6 women and a 10-year-old girl in attacks between 1995 and 1997. He didn't look like a stranger drifting in from nowhere. He was an Illinois native, and by the time his killing spree began, he was already a known quantity to the system. He had already spent. Illinois prison records held the blueprint for the violence to come, documenting prior convictions for aggravated kidnapping and aggravated criminal sexual assault. Detectives confirmed he walked out on parole in 1994, just before the bodies began to surface. This history leaves us with one haunting question. How much danger was already lurking in the system, and how close did authorities come to stopping him before it was too late? According to investigators, Runga's violence followed a cold, deliberate logic rather than mindless chaos. He didn't just strike, he engineered access. Cook County prosecutors explained how he manipulated his way into homes or used deception to gain a victim's trust. In specific instances, Police found he relied on help-wanted advertisements to lure women in. Other times, authorities said he used mundane excuses to look harmless until the door closed behind him. This is why the case still feels so dangerous. Visualize how safe those first few seconds of contact must have felt. A brief chat, a simple question, a small favor requested, and then, right in the middle of that routine moment, the entire world changes. The killing started on January 3rd, 1995, when Stacy Frobel vanished right near Runga's own townhouse complex. Searchers found her remains in pieces, discarded far from where she was last seen. That year, two Bosnian refugee sisters from Hanover Park, Zaneta and Emila Pasimajovic, also vanished, and prosecutors later stated that Runga confessed to their murders. By 1997, the pace of the violence accelerated again. Dota Jubac was murdered in January. On February 3rd, 1997, Yolanda Gutierrez and her 10-year-old daughter, Jessica Moon, were attacked inside their Chicago home. 7 murders confessed, 5 unpunished. Later, Kazmiera Paruk died. Detectives saw a nightmare, some strangled, some beaten, some dismembered, and one scene even torched to hide the evidence. The crimes looked different enough to mask a pattern, yet had a signature that kept investigators awake. But the smoking gun remained missing. Paul Runn was already jailed for parole violations, not for the bodies. Then the lab results arrived. DNA from the Gutierrez Moon scene pointed to his bunk. When detectives showed the proof, he broke. He didn't just admit 1. He confessed 7. Imagine that interrogation. Years of cold files and grieving families suddenly snapped into focus because of one thread. By June 2001, Chicago knew. Ruma faced 7 counts of murder and the death penalty. But the courtroom reality would get much messier than the headlines ever suggested. Police pinned 7 deaths on Runn, and he gave them everything. Yet his fate hinged on one Cook County file, the deaths of Yolanda Gutierrez and Jessica Moon. The Illinois Supreme Court documented the case as 2 counts of first-degree murder for them. In February 2006, he was convicted, but that distinction saved him. Publicly, Paul Runn was a 7-time killer. In court, his execution rested only on the mother and daughter. Forensics were the only way. In that era of justice, this trial carried massive weight. The state demanded death, and the jury signed off. CBS Chicago reported that after his 2006 conviction, the Supreme Court rejected his 2009 appeal. His execution date was set. For the families, this was it. The wait was over. They had a verdict and a date with the executioner. It felt like justice was done. Then, everything changed. Suddenly, the state pivoted on death. On March 9, 2011, Governor Pat Quinn abolished the death penalty. He spared 15 men on death row, handing them life sentences without parole. Runn was one of them. That signature effectively wiped out the other 5 cases. Between March and August, the state quietly walked away from the open files. They dropped cases for the Pasinovich sisters, Stacy Frobel, Droa Jubac, and Kazmiera Paruk. Prosecutors claimed no harsher penalty remained. For the families, the legal road simply ended there. The official record would never reflect his full scale. Records from March 2026 show Paul F. Room in Pontiac Correctional Center. He is serving life with 0 chance of walking free. His status is permanent. He's alive, locked up, and staying there. But is justice served when 5 murders go unprosecuted? History still attributes 7 deaths to him. His confession covered 7 lives, yet the legal papers keeping him in a cell for eternity only name 2. The shadow he leaves isn't just the body count. It's the terrifying, cold silence of his specific method. He didn't kick down doors. He acted helpful and safe. Most monsters force their way in. What if the monster just asks to help? This case haunts us because trust was his weapon. That realization is the most disturbing part of this entire story. It isn't just that he was linked to a string of Chicago murders. It's that he made lethal moments feel perfectly safe until they weren't. Number 9. Samuel Little. Most serial killer stories start with a bang. Samuel Little was a slow-burn nightmare no one saw coming. For 40 years, he drifted across America like a ghost, targeting women the world had already decided to forget. Then, as an old man already behind bars, he finally opened his mouth. The words he spoke were incomprehensible. He claimed 93 murders between 1970 and 2005. The FBI decided every single one of those 93 confessions was credible. By October 2019, they verified 50 deaths. He was officially the most prolific serial killer in American history. Imagine the horror of realizing the body count wasn't growing by one, but by the dozen. Before he became the face of undetected evil, Little was just a drifter who lived for the open road. Records and law enforcement accounts paint a picture of a former boxer. He hopped state lines, racking up minor arrests while hunting in the shadows of society. He hunted in the shadows of society, targeting women he knew the world would never miss. Their deaths were discarded as accidents or overdoses, ignored by a system that deemed them unworthy of attention. Imagine how this narrative shifts if even a handful of those early deaths were treated from day one as part of a pattern instead of separate tragedies. For decades, there was no public sense of a nationwide pattern with his specific name ever attached to it. No massive task force cracked this case by connecting dozens of victims. It eventually came down to DNA. In 2012, cops found Little at a Louisville shelter and extradited him all the way back to California. Once they had him, L.A. detectives matched his DNA to 3 unsolved cold cases from the late 1980s: Carol Alford in 1987, Audrey Nelson, and Guadalupe Apodaca, both in 1989. They found all 3 women in South Los Angeles after they were beaten and strangled to death. This violent drifter suddenly became the focal point of a nightmare far deeper than any local investigator ever realized. This trial served as the first legal anchor for a case that would soon sprawl across the entire country. In 2014, a Los Angeles jury convicted Samuel Little for those 3 murders, sentencing him to life without any possibility of parole. The legal system finally had him pinned down, but only for those 3 specific lives taken. Imagine being a family member in one of the other cold cases across the country. You never knew the man responsible for your daughter or sister was already behind bars under a different set of names. In reality, it was only the beginning of the full reckoning. The case widened after Texas Ranger James Holland and the FBI analysts began interviewing Little. That is when the scale changed. Little started describing victims from state after state, sketching portraits of the women he killed with chilling precision. The FBI said in 2018 he confessed to 90 murders. By October 2019, 93. The Bureau said his dates were not always exact, but law enforcement believed the confessions themselves were entirely credible and chilling. This is what makes the case deeply unnerving. Imagine sitting across from someone who calmly describes highways, bars, and outfits from a murder committed decades ago. Those memories had been waiting all along for someone patient enough to unlock them. That is also where the state of Illinois enters the story. Official records link Little to at least 2 confessions located in Illinois on the FBI public map. One involved a 26-year-old black woman who lived in Granite City. He said he killed her between 1976 and 1979 after meeting in St. Louis, and claimed another in East St. Louis. But here the language has to stay precise. On the FBI page, both Illinois entries are still listed as unmatched confessions rather than corroborated cases. So, when people say Samuel Little was linked to at least 2 Illinois victims, that is true in the sense that he confessed to them and the FBI posted the details. It is not the same as saying those Illinois cases reach the same level of courtroom proof as the 3 murders in Los Angeles. That difference between confession and confirmation is a huge part of the Samuel Little story. The Bureau made a point of saying many of his targets never even made it into the system at all. Some victims were identified as Jane Does. Some deaths were classified in ways that did not trigger a real homicide investigation for the police. Some bodies were never found at all. In other words, the reason his number grew so shockingly high was because he kept killing, and the system kept missing exactly who was missing. That part of the case lingers long after the headline of 93 victims. Imagine how many towns were involved. Every file and grieving family lived in a total vacuum for years. One man may have moved through all of them. Legally, however, the final chapter remained much narrower than the full map of his 93 confessions. Little passed away behind bars on December 30th, 2020, aged 80, during his life term. The Department of Corrections announced his death, with no sign of foul play reported in the notice. That means there was never going to be one giant trial for all 93 killings or the dozens that investigators were still trying to match. The official record remains a tiny fraction of the scale of what authorities believe he did. 3 Los Angeles murder convictions became the legal core. The rest became an enormous national effort to identify victims and close cases after the fact. What makes Samuel Little so difficult to forget is not just the number, it is the invisibility. He never craved the front-page spotlight. He thrived in the deep shadows we collectively created. This killer never left behind a single famous crime scene or an easy timeline to track. Instead, he just slipped through the cracks that already existed. Gaps in police work, in how we see victims, in public interest, and in who gets counted when they go missing. Think about how many murders would stay cold if he hadn't started talking. That might be the most terrifying realization of this whole story. It is not just that Samuel Little earned the title of America's most prolific serial killer, but that his path proves true. Violence can hide for decades when the victims belong to groups that our society is all too comfortable ignoring. Number 10. Arthur Hillard. When a Cook County jury finally convicted Arthur Hillard in December of 2025, the case carried a heavy burden that had been building up for years, not days. Diamond Turner was only 21 when someone stuffed her body into a trash can in a South Side alley back in March 2017. Nearly 3 years crawled by before authorities claimed DNA evidence finally pointed them toward Hillard for her brutal arrest, and another 6 years passed before that final verdict arrived. What does that kind of weight do to a grieving family? The silence. The haunting feeling that the truth is just sitting somewhere in the city, breathing the same air while the world keeps on turning. Regardless, before the public linked his name to the death of Diamond Turner, Hillard was not some ghost that nobody could find. Prosecutors and news outlets framed him as a Chicago local in his early 50s, a father of 5 children, and the building manager for the apartment complex, where the core of the investigation would eventually focus. Records also noted a long criminal past, though most of it involved minor offenses that never signaled the level of violence prosecutors would later claim he was capable of committing. That is precisely what makes these kinds of stories so deeply disturbing. Think about a neighbor who is already a fixture on the block, part of the background noise, and then, a few years later, that same face ends up at the heart of the city's most horrific, unsolved murders. Diamond Turner vanished in early March 2017. Her relatives reported that the last time anyone saw her, she was leaving Red's Lounge on South Stony Island Avenue alongside Arthur Hillard. The prosecution later detailed that witnesses spotted Turner later that night at a club inside the South Dorchester building Hillard ran, where they were reportedly seeing each other. They sat there drinking together in a place where they were known to be involved in a romantic relationship at the time. Then, the world went dark. On March 3rd, city workers found Turner's remains inside a garbage bin located over in Grand Crossing. Medical examiners determined she died from blunt force trauma and strangulation. How do you process that timeline if you are her family? She walks out of a bar. She is with a familiar face. And the very next thing you know, a sanitation worker is making a grisly discovery. What made this case so agonizing was the family's firm belief from the very start that they knew exactly who the police should be investigating. Turner's aunt claimed that her family and activist Andrew Holmes managed to secretly record Hillard talking shortly after the young woman's murder. In that tape, he supposedly detailed the killing with graphic precision while trying to pin the whole thing on one of his roommates. ABC7 also noted that when reporters confronted Hillard in 2017, he denied killing Turner and once again tried to shift the blame onto someone else. So for years, the family was trapped in a bizarre and cruel limbo, waiting for justice to arrive. They felt certain the killer was standing right in front of the world, yet they had to watch the case sit untouched. Imagine that frustration month after month, year after year, wondering if almost solved is actually just the same as not. Then came the twist in the narrative that made it impossible for the public to look away anymore. While the state crime lab and local police were still processing DNA from the Turner scene, things took a turn. Hillard got caught up in another death. In September 2018, Andre Carl Williams was found in a shopping cart in an alley behind another building Hillard managed on the west side. Security footage, according to the state, showed Hillard actually wheeling the victim's body out into that alleyway. In January 2019, he entered a guilty plea, not for the actual murder, but for concealing a homicidal death, taking a 300-day sentence that meant he only served about 150 days behind bars, plus some probation. Then, when Turner's case finally gained momentum in 2020, another shadow emerged. Prosecutors labeled Hillard a suspect in a third 2019 killing following a dispute, though I found no record of public charges filed in that case during my research. That specific detail shifts the entire emotional weight of this tragedy. Could another life have been saved if the first murder had been solved just a little faster? The hunt for Diamond Turner's killer eventually centered entirely on the results of forensic testing. Chicago detectives and the state lab started publicly blaming one another for the massive delays, but the truth remained clear. DNA tied Hillard to the murder. The police department finally received the state's conclusive forensic report in 2019. A warrant dropped that October, and they caught him in January 2020 after claiming he was hard to find because of a violation of his existing probation. He faced charges of first-degree murder, and the judge ordered him held without any bond. Prosecutors believe Arthur Hillard killed 3 people. Media focused on the DNA evidence and his suspicious behavior after Diamond Turner finally vanished. Public records show a defense built on nothing but hollow denials and a weak play to shift the blame elsewhere. In December 2025, jurors rejected his lies and found him guilty on 3 counts, including murder and concealing a homicide. But Hilliard's case connects to a much darker Chicago secret: a serial killer. His arrest renewed the hunt. Police investigated if one predator was responsible for a cluster of female strangulations on the city's south and west sides. Is Arthur Hillard that monster? They already linked Turner's death to those killings. The method was identical, and CBS reported that police planned to recheck DNA from other unsolved cases against Hilliard's profile. Was there a match? That is where we have to be very careful. This conviction gives Diamond Turner's family peace. It does not prove the existence of the broader Chicago Strangler theory yet. Imagine the unease. One name is linked to one case, while a larger, unresolved pattern of death still hovers in the background. Legally, the story is clearer now than it was for years. But it is not fully finished. Hillard killed Diamond Turner. He previously admitted to concealing the body of Andrew Williams. What else? ABC 7's December 2025 report said he was due back in court for post-trial motions later that month. I did not find a later verified sentencing report in any of the sources. So, according to the latest reliable public reporting, the conviction is officially in place, but the final sentencing stage was never clearly documented anywhere. This matters because true crime stories often flatten everything into a dramatic ending. Real cases are rarely that neat. Sometimes after a guilty verdict, paperwork and hearings remain. Why are some questions still left completely unanswered? What lingers about Arthur Hillard isn't just the verdict. It's the feeling of how long the truth stayed within reach without ever locking fully. A family says he knew. A recording exists. Another body is found in another alley. Who was next? Prosecutors point to a third killing. DNA takes years, and only then does the courtroom finally catch up slowly. Imagine standing in Diamond Turner's place and asking the one question that haunts so many cases like this. If the system moved faster, how many later chapters would never have been written? That is the part that will last the longest. Not simply that Arthur Hillard was found guilty of killing Diamond Turner, but that the case leaves an uneasy sense that justice arrived, just not when it was first needed by the victims.